As part of our One Book, One Congregation event this year that we're reading together, Sarah Hurwitz's book, Here All Along, on one Shabbat of every month, I give a Devar Torah about one of the chapters. And so tonight is about chapter 4, called Mitzvot and the Spirituality of Doing. In Fiddler on the Roof, Tevye and Golda are struggling with raising their daughters in a world that is changing, and how to be loving and supportive of them when they don't understand the choices that they are making. In a particular crisis moment in the musical, Tevye turns to Golda and says, "Do you love me?" And Golda, who seems a little bit annoyed, says, "Do I love you? For 25 years, I've washed your clothes, cooked your meals, cleaned your house, given you children, milked your cow." This is the most theologically Jewish song in Fiddler on the Roof. How is that so? Because what Golda is saying to Tevye is, love is about action. It's about what we do for each other. It's not words that we say. It's not even sometimes a feeling in the heart, but real love is how we express it and how we deeply care for others. And I've deeply cared for you in all of these ways, and that's exactly what we learn in our tradition. V'ahavta et Adonai Elohecha, we shall love the eternal, our God, with all our heart, soul, and might. And people say, how can we be commanded to love, Rabbi? But then it tells us how we love. It's not about what we feel. It's about saying the Shema when we rise up and when we lie down. It's about being conscious of our actions when we're on our home and on our way. It's about teaching the mitzvot, teaching the ways to be in the world to our children. And how are we told to teach our children, V'shinantam levanecha v'dibarta bam, as we chanted tonight, that we are to tell them about our tradition and what the commandments are and about what our traditions are, and we're supposed to model them. That it's not good enough that we just say to our children, do as I say. All of us who have our own children, who ever worked with children, know that our actions speak much louder than our words ever do. The V'ahavta, that loving God, is about how we behave with each other and how we act in the world. Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, a rabbi from the previous century, says this about what it means to be a Jewish person. A Jew is asked to take a leap of action rather than a leap of faith. We do not have faith in deeds. We attain faith through deeds. That through the action of doing, we develop relationship, just like Golda was trying to say to Tevye. Through all these actions, we've developed this relationship and have learned to love each other. And that through doing, we begin to understand more what it means to be a loving person in the world, a good person. In a few weeks, we're going to read in the Torah that the Jewish people received the Torah and they said these words, Na'aseh v'nishma. They say to God, we will do and we will hear, we will listen. And one might think that they got it backwards. We will listen and then we'll do, right? Isn't that what we usually think? We listen and then we do, but no. Torah says, the Jewish people said, we will do, and through the doing is where we will gain understanding. My professor in rabbinic school, Rabbi Larry Hoffman, who taught us liturgy, used to say, we can teach people about the liturgy and you should teach them the words and what those words mean, but people will do rituals not because there's some intellectual connection with them. And as a matter of fact, Israelis sometimes have a harder time with prayer than Americans do. Why? Because they actually understand all the words. That people who don't speak Hebrew as a first language can come in with feeling, and people who understand Hebrew as a first language have to go to the head first instead of to the heart, and that's a problem. Believe me, I talked to a lot of Israelis about prayer. He said to us, you can explain to someone, for example, what the commandment is behind lighting Shabbat candles, where it comes from. This idea that one candle is supposed to representing Shamor, that we need to guard the commandments, and the other is supposed to remember Zachor, we should remember them, and that's why we have 2 candles. You can explain all that. That's not going to be the reason people light candles, though, right? If people want to understand why to light Shabbat candles, tell them go home and light Shabbat candles for 2 months every Friday night, and then you'll come back and have a conversation about it. Because it's through the doing that people begin to have a connection with that particular act. Perhaps at that particular moment in which they light the candles, they remember their family from the past who did this. Perhaps their family didn't light candles, but perhaps they think in their head and their heart about all the Jews over the millennia who lit Shabbat candles, and there's a deeper connection than just the intellectual, why do I light candles? That through doing, we begin to understand in a deeper way. According to Jewish tradition, there are 613 mitzvot in the Torah. And what is a mitzvah? Sometimes we translate that as good deeds, sometimes more literally as commandment. I like to think of the mitzvot are ways to act in the world in consonance with what God wants from us, as interpreted through rabbinic tradition. Ways to act in the world in consonance with what God would want from us as it has been interpreted and handed down from generation to generation. Which means that it does grow and change, it doesn't stay static. As I've said numerous times before, if anybody tells you that there is a part of the Jewish people that is not interpreting Torah and text and even mitzvot, don't believe them. We're an interpretive tradition. Whether we're Orthodox, Conservative, Reform, or whatever we are in the Jewish world, there's an interpretive tradition. And through that tradition, though, that's been handed to us, we respect what has come before. We have to use our own insight to decide what's for today, and then to figure out what it means to pass on the tradition to the next generation. And there are both ritual and ethical mitzvot. So there's the mitzvot to light the Shabbat candles. And then there are the mitzvot about how we treat our neighbor, how we act in business with honest weights and measures. We have both kinds of mitzvot. And both of them are important because they help develop us human beings and make connections to ourselves, to God, to others, to our tradition. And in fact, the word mitzvah also has an Aramaic root, savta. And the Aramaic root means to attach or join. That we do a mitzvah to develop ourselves, to understand ourselves better, to develop relationships with each other. When I light Shabbat candles, I think about my children, and I think about Jews all over the world lighting Shabbat candles, and I think about sending those blessings out into the world. There's a deep connection that happens over time and space. And ultimately, however we might understand a relationship with holiness or divinity. Mordecai Kaplan, the founder of the Reconstructionist movement, said this about the mitzvot, that they're a way to facilitate the process of our becoming our best and truest self, that they help us grow, and they're a way to connect with something higher. And Sarah Hurwitz in her book says, spirituality is less a pursuit of once-in-a-lifetime highs and more a series of routine practices. That the regularity of doing things helps us to grow step by step, to connect more deeply with each other step by step. We're communal people. And when we do similar actions, we can bind ourselves together with each other. And in this week's Torah portion, we get our first mitzvah as a collective community. And what is the first mitzvah that we're given in Torah? Here in the book of Exodus, chapter 12. Chapter 12 begins with the commandment to observe the new moon, the beginning of the first month of the year, which is called in this week's Torah portion, Chodesh Aviv, the spring month. It later gets a name change to Nisan during the Babylonian period, but here it's just called the spring month, and it is a holiday in which we celebrate Passover. And we're told to observe the beginning of the new moon. It's the first mitzvah. The first mitzvah we get as a collective is to observe sacred time. Because when we observe sacred time, it helps brings us together as a people. That if we observe Shabbat at the same time, if we take off the same day, then we can come together and we can create relationships and deepen relationships with each other and with our tradition. And so sacred time is very important. And taken together, all of the mitzvot are called the halakha, which means the way that we walk. Halakha comes from the word lalechet, to walk. In the Orthodox world, Orthodox Jews will uphold the mitzvot as they have been interpreted and passed down to them over the millennium. But what do we do as Reformed Jews? People often say to me, yeah, the Orthodox, they have to do all those things. You know, me as a Reformed Jew, I'll do a little bit of this and a little bit of that, and I'll decide what I want to do. And that's true. We do have a choice. What are the advantages and disadvantages about how our respective denominations look and understand to mitzvot? Well, in Orthodoxy, there is conformity. As Reformed Jews, we often complain about that. They walk in lockstep with each other, and they all have to do the same thing. But in that conformity, there's also unity and community. In the Reform movement, we don't have that kind of conformity. We have a great deal of autonomy, but much less unity. And so what do we do with that? My Talmud teacher in rabbinic school, who was an Orthodox Jew, said, I'll tell you what I love about being Orthodox. He said, there are as many Jews present in synagogue on Shmini Atzeret, a holiday that almost no one here can define what it is, as there are on Yom Kippur. Because everybody has an obligation. Whereas in the Reform movement, people will make a choice. I'll come this time, and I won't come this time. I'll come when it's convenient, when the weather's not bad. I'll do what I want to do. And there is something that's positive about that. But where is community and all of that autonomy? Another teacher of mine, Rabbi Eugene Borowitz, who was considered to be the greatest Reformed theologian of our generation, wrote a book called Renewing the Covenant, and he said we have to think about ourselves in covenant with God, and that in covenant we have certain responsibilities. A covenant is a relationship, and when we have relationships with each other, as I've spoken about, that we do things in relationship because we love somebody and care about them. And the same thing goes with our relationship with God. And he says autonomy is part of modern life. And yes, the Orthodox world can try to live in this way, and some people will choose to do that, but people have to choose to actually be Orthodox. Nobody can be forced to be anything. And so we in the Reform movement, we can choose to put an obligation upon ourselves. And that if we don't choose a little bit of obligation, where is their community? And where is their continuity in the Jewish world? That without autonomy has to go some sense, as Rabbi Borowitz used to say, of duty. He was a very proper man and always wore a three-piece suit. And the only time I saw him let his guard down is when I brought Yonah as a baby to class, and he used to love babies. And after class, as he's teaching and renewing the covenant and all of these great grand ideas, he comes over and starts tickling him and playing with his fingers and toes. It was the cutest thing ever. But a sense of duty and love. And so as we think about the mitzvot from a Reform perspective, these are the questions I'd like us to ask ourselves. What holds us together as a community? Do we need to have a set of rules we all agree to follow in order to really keep a sense of community? And if we were to create those rules for us that everybody would follow, what would those be? Which mitzvot would we choose? And the final question I have is, who would decide what those would be? Would it be the rabbi? Would it be Lee, the president of the congregation? Would it be a community of elders? It might sound like a nice idea that we would have something that we'd all agree that we need to observe these because this is what brings us together as community, and this is what's going to help us grow as individuals, and this is what's going to help us bring greater divinity and wholeness and holiness into the world. But it's a challenge. It's not something we've been able to solve as Reformed Jews. But I think that there's a little bit of a hint in this week's Torah portion about what those major commandments might look like. Later on in chapter 12, we're going to get the commandments for the observance of Passover. And in fact, the first Passover celebration happens in this week's Torah portion between the 9th and the 10th plague. Before the Israelites are freed from Egyptian bondage, they celebrate the first Passover. And how do they celebrate the first Passover? There are 3 symbols of that first Passover. They're called Pesach, Matzah, and Maror. Pesach is the lamb that is sacrificed. Matzah, of course, we know, is that delicious cracker that we eat for 7 days. And Maror is the bitter herb. That's how God tells them to celebrate. It's not yet an elaborate Seder, just Pesach, Matzah, and Maror. And so they sacrifice a lamb. And with that lamb's blood, we put a mark on our door so that the angel of death will pass over. And so Pesach reminds us that we need to be grateful for our freedom, but that our freedom came with a price because, of course, the Egyptians, their firstborn, lost their lives. And so a very important mitzvah we all need to observe is that gratitude and appreciation and understanding others who have been harmed. Matzah. Matzah is called lechem oni, which means the food for those who are impoverished. Matzah reminds us we need to care for the poor. As we say in Passover, let all who are hungry come and eat. The matzah reminds us that we have want and that we have a responsibility to take care of that want. And maror, that freedom comes with the responsibility to address the bitterness in the world. Pesach, gratitude for our freedom. Matzah, our responsibility to care for others who are in want. And that freedom comes with responsibility to address bitterness. What if we could just try to agree that these would be the 3 mitzvot that we would all follow as Reformed Jews? It might not be quite enough, but it might be a good start. As Tevye learned, love is about action. It's about doing. Not because someone demands it, not because God is commanding it from on high and saying to us, you must do it, but out of our love for others, ourselves, and our desire to do that which is right and good in the world. That ultimately, this is what it means to live by the mitzvot. Shabbat Shalom.